Thankful for your presence tonight. We began a study some time ago from the book of Job, a series of studies really, not just an effort to try to go through the book verse by verse. We've done that before, but really a series of lessons that concentrated on key figures in the book of Job. We began with Job and looked at Job as a sufferer in the dark, and how that God does not promise in this life that we will escape suffering even if we serve Him faithfully, nor does He promise He's going to always tell us why. But we find in Job some great lessons, some negative lessons and some positive. The overall arching lesson from Job is his patience, his endurance of suffering. So that's one thing that certainly we appreciate about Job. We also looked at a lesson on Job's friends. Actually, a couple of lessons that wound up being, and how that well-meaning people, and I think they were well-meaning people, can make a mess of things. We can make things worse. We can assume what we don't know, and we can do a lot of damage. And their own souls were in jeopardy because of their assumptions about life that were misguided. And there are great warnings there for us too. Recently, we began a study of Satan in the book of Job. And this really gets sort of the heart of why I decided to share this series. There was a question that came up about, does Satan really tempt us? Or are we maybe making more than should be there? And I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think we find some very powerful statements in the book of Job that are worth noting. And so we want to continue our study tonight on that point of Satan in the book of Job. And I'd like to start by noticing with you three false notions that some have about Satan's work in the book of Job in particular. Nothing false about the book of Job, but there's some false assumptions that people make about the devil in the book of Job. Let me suggest those three. First of all, there are some who suggest that Satan really was unknown to Job. That Job was a man over here, a righteous man, but folks in the patriarchal age had no idea that there was a Satan. All that came later, and they didn't. One fellow wrote, the thing missing from the whole central section of Job is the knowledge of Satan. That leaves Job and his friends apparently in total ignorance regarding the part that Satan had in the fall of mankind. A brother in Christ wrote that. I find that incredible that a man would come to that conclusion after reading the book of Job as carefully as you'd think a commentator on a guy written a book about Job, would do. Another fellow wrote, the man who suffers so monstrously, that is Job, at the hands of Satan, is kept entirely in the dark as to the very existence of his spiritual foe. Nowhere in the long and exhaustive dialogue between Job and his friends is the idea of a personal, supernatural evil so much as broached as a possibility. Is that true? And then I think another common misconception about Job, at least in some quarters, is that Satan is absent in the last 40 chapters of Job. We read about him in the first 2 chapters, and then we find out a hint of him later on. One fellow wrote, Satan does not appear again throughout the whole book. Well, if you mean by that his name is used, the name Satan, that's one thing. But it's a different thing to say he's not called by name as to say that we can't find him. I think we find him all over the place. And finally, I don't remember anybody ever teaching this per se. There are some who have somehow connoted the idea that the book of Job and the story of, let's just draw it up as a great triangle, and here we have God, and then we have Job, and then we have Satan. That this triangle, if you will, is really an extraordinary case in the book of Job. Almost unique, if not unique. And that really the story here is just a very strange aberration. Satan becoming personally involved in the life of this man under the limits that God places, trying to destroy him while God is working to strengthen him. Is that really such a strange story? Well, let's start at the first here. You know, was Satan unknown? Was he a mystery character to the patriarchs? I don't think so. And I think the book of Job makes that plain. And we'll not spend a lot of time on this, but if you look in the 4th chapter of Job, here's the speech of Eliphaz. He's had this dream, you know, in which he's been told how that, mortal man is such a low, worthless creature that there's no way that he can ever merit any interest from God. That is, God puts no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. Who does Job think he is when God has charged the angels with folly? The word angel there, angelo, or in the Greek angelos, and the Hebrew, just as in the Greek, means messenger. But I don't know any translation that doesn't translate this word as angel. Now, if in the book of Job we find reference made to angels that were charged with folly, that is, with sin, and brought down, doesn't that remind you of the picture in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4? The angels that sinned were cast down to hell. If the people in the book of Job knew that story, and Eliphaz certainly did, how could they not know about the devil? Later on, again, Eliphaz in the 15th chapter, in verse 15, makes the same point in different words. God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. Job, who do you think you are when some of the angels were cast down? How do you think you're above criticism when these high and holy angels have been brought low? If they knew that story, they knew the story of Satan. Now, the 26th chapter, and in verse 13, this passage certainly there is some question about the translation. Now, this is actually a translation of the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, Brenton's English translation of the Septuagint. And he renders the passage this way: "And the barriers of heaven fear him, and by command he has slain the apostate dragon." Who's that sound like? He has slain the apostate dragon. All these are a part of his way. Now, to be fair, other translations render the passage differently. For example, the King James Version, instead of talking about the apostate dragon, what's the term he uses there? He hath formed the crooked serpent. Different words translated different ways. But I think you can make a case in this passage. There's some who think that Job is just talking about, by the crooked serpent, some constellation. And God rules the stars. And that's his only point. But I really think I can make a case in this passage that Job is talking about something far-reaching, more far-reaching than that. And I won't take a lot of time with this, but you know, he's answering Bildad here. If you've got your Bible open in chapter 25, Bildad asked the question in verse 4, how then can a man be justified with God or clean with God? You know, even the moon and the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less a man? And I think Job picks up where Bildad left off and said, you think that God is greater than the moon and the stars? I can go beyond that. God indeed is greater than the moon and the stars. But in that realm beyond this realm, beyond the material universe, verse 6, for example, chapter 26, hell is naked before him, and destruction hath no covering. The Hebrew words Sheol and Abaddon are used there to describe the realm of the dead, and even the realm where the wicked dead are. I think Job, in this context, is taking the argument of Bildad and taking it further. He's saying, well, you know, Job, you can't be right with God. God is the ruler of the stars. Job says, God is the ruler of more than the stars. He's the ruler of what's beyond the stars. But I'm still not guilty of what you accuse me of. In that context, I could certainly see Job saying, he has slain the apostate dragon. That is the devil and his work. I don't think that's a far-fetched interpretation of the passage. Again, the point is, did the people, the patriarchs, the folks in Job's age know about spiritual battles and evil angels? Yes. Look in Job 31 and verse 33, the last speech of Job. And Job here is putting himself, as it were, under a curse, you remember, in this section. And he's saying, if I've done this, then may I be cursed. He's been accused of everything in the book. He says, if I'm guilty of that, then let me be cursed. I don't object to being punished. And at one point he says, if I covered my transgressions as Adam, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom. Now somebody might say, well, the word Adam, in Hebrews can be translated man as well. But I see no reason to take this passage any way other than specifically. You remember the story in Genesis chapter 3. What happened after Adam and Eve sinned? They hid themselves. Now, if Job knew the story of the fall of man, I realize that Moses may not have written it yet. Does that mean that man didn't know about the fall? That none of these stories men were aware of? I find that incredible. Did they forget that all of a sudden? If Job and his friends were aware of the story of Adam and his fall, how could they not be aware of the serpent, the apostate dragon, the angels that fell? So the idea that somehow Satan was just unknown to man at this time, to me, is just not true, and it's disproven even by the book of Job itself. Let me go to a second point. The second point is, people say, well, you just don't find Satan after the first two chapters. Oh, yeah, you do. He may not be called by name, but boy, you see him everywhere. For example, let me just make this point in passing. That spirits don't have to be seen with the eye or called by name to be working. What do we learn from Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2? That angels are busy about the work of God. In fact, in Hebrews 13:2, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, the Hebrew writer warns us, because he says, thereby some have entertained angels unawares. People, maybe they've asked you this question. Somebody asked me, well, you ever seen an angel? I think about my best answer to that is, not that I know of. But I sure wouldn't rule it out. I think angels work in this world. They're ministering spirits sent forth to minister to them, which are heirs of salvation, Hebrews 1:14. So, just as angels can work without being seen, there's a story about Martin Luther. Martin Luther, while he was translating the Bible into German, it is said, saw the devil in the corner. Devil's always bothering Martin Luther. Sometimes he'd hide his glasses or do something like that. But finally, this is according to Luther, finally Luther got so mad at him, he took the inkwell and threw it at the wall over there at the devil. And if you visit the chambers where Luther translated the Bible, you can see the ink spot on the wall. Well, I believe he might have thrown something against the wall. Do I believe he saw the devil? No. But do I believe the devil works? Yeah, I do. And so we find here in the book of Job, I think, evidence of the devil working, even if he did not appear in corporeal form or if he wasn't called by name. For example, and maybe this comes immediately to your mind, if you look at the story in Job, the 2nd chapter, of Job's wife. In Job chapter 2 and verse 9, after Job had suffered physically, his wife said to him, why dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. But he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. She asked the question, why do you retain your integrity? You ever thought about, meditated on what that says, really? She puts herself on one side and integrity on the other. Integrity is useless. Integrity is worthless. What does integrity mean? It means innocence. It means principles. That's the way one translation translates it. It's the same word that's used over in the 11th chapter of Proverbs. This is a great passage, and a great passage for our young people to keep in mind as well. In Proverbs chapter 11 and in verse 3, the wise man there wrote that the integrity of the upright shall guide them. The integrity of the upright shall guide them. He had said in the first verse, that famous passage, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. You remember the setting there? In days when people weighed out commodities, if you were selling things by the pound, to put it in our language, maybe you'd want a weight there that would be a little lighter than a pound, so that you could charge people for really more than you were giving them. You know, fudge the numbers, adjust the weights so that they'd be in your favor. You make some money that way. Think about how much money you'd make if your numbers were just off a little bit and you were selling and selling and selling. At the end of the day, well, you'd have a lot of money. A lot more than you would if you were being honest. Yeah, but you'd have the disfavor of God on you. What the wise man said is that it's principle that guides. That a man is guided by his integrity. The integrity of the upright shall guide them. What that says is we don't have to make up our mind from day to day, are we going to do right or do wrong? We've already made that choice. We've determined we're going to do the right thing. We're going to follow righteousness. Now that sounds very simple, I know, but I tell you, that really, if a man can make up his mind about that, he's going to have a lot of his problems answered. We may struggle sometimes to know what is right, and that is a struggle. But once a man knows what's right, he knows what he's going to do. He's not the kind of guy that wakes up on Sunday morning and says, am I going to go to church today or not? Am I going to be honest today or not? He knows what he's going to do. Integrity guides him. And that's the essence, really, of a righteous man. He's a man dedicated to doing the right thing, as best he knows, as best God gives him the light to see. Now, back to our point. Here's Mrs. Job saying, what's the use of doing right? That's a pretty serious thing to say, isn't it? What use is righteousness? What's it gotten us? Curse God and die. I'm still not sure exactly what she meant by that part, dying. I think she's talking about physical death. Did she mean, why don't you just let cursing be your last act? Curse God, by the way, it's the same word that was used in chapter 1 by the devil when he said, you just let me have him and he'll curse you to your face. And here we have Job's wife repeating the same words, encouraging Job to do the devil's will. Curse God and die. Did she mean curse God and jump off a cliff? Or does she mean curse God and let him strike you down like he struck our family down? I'm not exactly sure, but neither one is good. Let me say just this word about Mrs. Job. You know, again, we've tried to make the point throughout this study. It's a big mistake to make these characters cartoon characters. Job is not a cartoon character. He's a real man. When you cut him, he bled. He felt the pain. Job's friends were not cartoon villains. They were people like you and I. And they thought they were doing good, and they were making a big mess of things. And I think Job's wife also, maybe I've veered into this at some point in time. People say things like, well, you know, I'll tell you how the devil tempted Job. He took away everything that he had and all his servants, and then he left Job's wife right there. He said, that's how he did it. You know, Job's wife lost 10 children. 10. And everything else that they had, materially, Job lost and she lost. I have no justification for what this woman said to Job, her husband. But I'd say this too. I ain't been where she's been either. I can't tell you, look, I lost 10 children. I didn't do that. I know what I ought to do. I don't think Job thought of her as a fool. He said, you speak as one of the foolish women. But it's interesting to me, Job's wife is mentioned 3 times in the book of Job. She's mentioned here most famously. But over in the 19th chapter of Job, she's referred to again. In Job 19 and verse 17, I think it is, the reference where Job is speaking, and he says this, my breath is strange to my wife. Then he talks about, I think, his other kinfolks. Most of the time, when I read someone trying to explain this verse to me, they seem to take the word breath just as it's translated here, and they make it somehow a statement about how that Job's disease had made his breath unpleasant to smell. And that may be true, but I don't really think that's what he's talking about here. The word, again, I don't know anything about Hebrew, but the word breath here, ruach, just like with the Greek language, pneuma. The word pneuma can mean several things. It can mean breath, like pneumonia. We borrow that word. It can mean the wind. And it could also mean the spirit, the unseen force inside a man. And the word ruach, they tell me, is the same way. I don't really think he's talking about the breath or the wind. I think he's talking about the spirit that Job had. And what he's saying is that this tragedy has happened, and now I'm estranged from my wife. And my spirit is strange to her. I think we just read about that. Job said, I'm still trying to serve God. I'm still trying to figure out why. And she says, why don't you just quit and give up? There's no future in serving God. Have you not got that message yet? Just entirely different. My wife had a classmate, someone she went to high school with. She and her husband had a great tragedy in their life. They lost their child in a boating accident. And a few years later, they wound up divorcing. And if you investigate a little bit, what you'll find is that's pretty common with folks in the world, that people, when they face a loss like the loss of a child, that it tends to just change everything about them, and they wind up drifting apart and even becoming at enmity with each other. Maybe there's some subconscious blame, who knows why, but it happens a lot. Now, can you imagine a woman lost 10 children? My spirit, I might say, is strange to my wife. But I'd make this point that Job regretted that, it seems. He wasn't happy about that. Good riddance. We can't talk about this woman that way. We can condemn her for what she did, but we can't talk about her, I think, in ways that sometimes is common. One more reference is over in the 31st chapter of Job. And again, this is where Job is putting himself under a curse. And what he talks about here is he says, look, you accuse me of all kinds of sins of the flesh. Let me tell you something. If I've been guilty of that, then let my wife commit adultery on me. Let my wife be an adulteress. If I'm guilty of the things that you accuse me of. Well, it's obvious by the way Job speaks in that regard. That's 31:10, by the way. It's obvious the way Job speaks in that regard, that would be a horrible consequence to him. And just a little add-on there. At the end of the book, when Job is blessed to have another family, if there's another wife involved in that, it's not mentioned. So I just say, maybe we ought to have a little more mercy on Job's wife, while at the same time fully condemning what she did. Because what she did was she promoted the will of Satan. She let the tragedy that she felt and the loss that she felt motivate her to use her mouth to try to discourage her husband and get him just to quit caring about God. Now that's a terrible thing. And I think we see the voice of Satan in this woman. You can't find Satan after chapter 2. How about chapter 3? Chapter 4, on and on. But chapter 2, right here in verse 9, we find, I think, his work. You remember how that the Lord in Matthew 16, and it's interesting how that right on the heels of the great confession that Peter made, whom do men say that I am? Whom do you say that I am? You're the Christ, the Son of God. Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh is not revealed to thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And then the Lord told them later on in Matthew 16 and in verse 21, from that time forth Jesus began to show his disciples how that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him, and said, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. And he said what? He said, Get thee behind me, Satan. We don't give up on Peter, do we? He did something terrible. He parroted really the will of Satan. You don't have to die on the cross. You don't have to suffer. Just fall down and worship me. And so I think we find the work of Satan in the mouth of Job's wife here. I think we find it in the friends of Job. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but again, in the 4th chapter of Job, I mentioned in an earlier part of the lesson, one of the things we learned about the devil is he has a real disgust and disregard for men. That in the book of Job, when the devil, Satan, talks to God about humanity, about Job, he says, skin for skin. All that a man hath, he'll give to save his life. Does Job fear God for nothing? This is a con man. This is a puny worm of the dust. You know, God doesn't talk about humanity that way. God's own Son became humanity. But the devil has a real disregard for humanity. And you find that in the language of Job's friends, particularly Eliphaz. I mentioned to you a moment ago that Eliphaz claimed he had a dream in which someone from above, he thought, revealed to him certain facts. Can a mortal man be more just than God? This is chapter 4, verse 17. Shall a man be more pure than his maker? Lord, he puts no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. How much less them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which are crushed before the moth. All we have is taken away. We die still lacking wisdom. Does that sound like God's view of man? I think that Eliphaz got that somewhere else. I think that Eliphaz's dream might have been a vision from somewhere else and not God. Later on, in the 15th chapter, Eliphaz again speaking says, if the angels were condemned, and if I'm right, and this is really the devil speaking and convincing Eliphaz, he's talking about himself there. If those of us who are great spirits have been condemned, how can God ever look with favor upon an abominable, filthy man? Can a human being, chapter 22 and verse 1, be of any use to God? Is the Almighty pleased when you're righteous? I think the worst might be in chapter 25 in that speech of Bildad we looked at a moment ago. How can a person be righteous to God? How can anyone born of woman be pure? Even the moon isn't bright, and the stars aren't pure in his sight. How much less pure is a mortal who is only a maggot, a descendant of Adam who is a worm? Does that sound like something that God would say? Do you reckon that he got that from God? If you look over in the 38th chapter A couple of times, God challenges Job at the end of the book, you remember. And he tells Job that now is the time for him to speak and to answer. He says, gird up now thy loins like a man, and I will demand of thee, and thou shalt answer me. What do you suppose? Do you think we could substitute the word maggot there? Gird up your loins like a maggot. Does that fit? No, I don't believe so at all. God thought more of man. The psalmist said, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels. But the devil says man is a maggot. And here you have men parroting the devil. My point is, I think we hear the devil's voice throughout the book. Even in Job himself sometimes. You know, Job had these periodic losses of trust, I think. He had low points where he had harsh things to say about God. Now, again, I'm not here to compare scars with Job or say, I would have done so much better, but it's clear that there were times when Job was out of line. And sometimes it's interesting to note how Job was so inconsistent, how that he could not see the fault in himself. Look with me, for example, in the 16th chapter of Job. Let me try to explain what I'm saying here. In Job 16, Job has some harsh words for his friends who had let him down and had become accusers. Job answered and said, the chapter begins, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Eliphaz had just torn into him again. Verse 3, shall vain words have an end? Or what emboldeneth thee that thou answerest? I also could speak as you do. If your soul were in my soul's stead, I could heap up words against you. I could shake my head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the moving of my lips should assuage your grief. Job said, I could treat you like you're treating me. If roles reversed, I would never do you like you've done me. How could you turn on me like this? How could you doubt me so? And then in verse 6, though I speak, my grief is not assuaged. Though I forbear, what am I eased? But now he hath made me weary. Thou hast made desolate all my company. And he's talking about God here. He turns from his friends, plural, and he talks about the one who is tormenting him. Thou hast filled me with wrinkles, which is a witness against me. And my leanness rising up in me beareth witness to my face. He teareth me with his wrath, who hated me. He gnasheth upon me with his teeth. Mine enemy sharpeneth his eyes upon me. They have gaped upon me with their mouth. They have smitten me with upon the cheek reproachfully. They've gathered themselves together against me. God hath delivered me to the ungodly. You've done your damage, but ultimately it's God who has hurt me so. He has broken me asunder, verse 12. He is the one that has taken me by the neck and shaken me to pieces. Verse 17, not for any injustice on my part. The point is that Job, who speaks so reproachfully of his friends, and how could you turn on me like this? How could you forget our relationship? Has the same harsh things to say in reference to God. I like what one fellow wrote about this. He talked about the irony here. He said, the way he rages against God, slandering him in the plainest fashion, is breathtaking. You might be tempted to think that Job had never known God's friendship and blessing. You'd be tempted to forget that God had a history, a life with Job, that should have allowed him the benefit of any doubt. But once Job got going about God, it was all daggers at close quarters. He rages at what his friends are doing to him and does the same to God. In other words, Job says to his friends, why does my life with you mean nothing? All the years we spent together. Then he turns around and God would say to his friend, does my life with you down through the years mean nothing? Or Job would say to his friends, won't you give me the benefit of the doubt? God could say the same to Job. Won't you give me the benefit of the doubt? Job says to his friends, you're faced with something you don't understand, so you accuse me of all kind of wickedness. God could say the same thing to Job. You're faced with what you don't understand, and you accuse me of all kind of wickedness. Job says to his friends, aren't friends supposed to remain loyal to one another, even in tough times? And God will say to Job, aren't friends supposed to remain loyal to one another, even in tough times? I don't want to underestimate Job's pain. I know he felt that pain. But he could certainly have given God the benefit of the doubt. That's what I believe the Bible teaches. And I have no doubt that Job, in his complaint, his bitter, accusing complaint, was indeed voicing the voice of God, a voice of Satan, I should say, against God. So here's the point. You know, we have two extremes when it comes to Job and Satan, and the work of Satan in particular. There's some who would say, you know, the devil made me do it. We've heard that old expression. And they give the devil too much credit. And I recognize the fact that Satan is not omniscient, he's not omnipotent. But on the other hand, I think there is a danger on the other extreme to suggest that somehow Satan is almost out of business. I heard a brother give a series of, 6 or 8 lectures on Satan and his work. And he railed in those lectures. Over and again, he came back to this point. These preachers that preach about Satan being a danger to us and scaring people to death, he said, you need to understand that Satan is a loser. He's chained up. He's finished. And quit scaring people about Satan like he can do something to you. And he waxed so eloquent, he said, after a while, he said this. He said, I'll tell you, if God destroyed Satan tomorrow, the world wouldn't notice. And after a while, I just thought, what Bible are you reading from? Now, what would make a smart fellow make a statement like that? Well, if you listen to it, he keeps coming back to this point. Satan is not God. He's not all-powerful. Well, I agree with that. But surely between the idea of making Satan God and suggesting that if the devil was eliminated tomorrow, nobody would notice, there is the truth. You know, there's an idea about God called Deism, and you may have run into that at some point. It's an idea that goes like this, that yes, God created the universe, but I tell you what he did. Once he created it and set it in motion, he just let it go. It's a little bit like taking a big giant ball, a rock, and just rolling it off a hill. And it just bounces where it will. The person who rolls the rock has no more control over it or influence upon it. He starts the process and it finishes itself. And there are those who think of the work of the devil that way. I think deism is a sorry philosophy, frankly. I think it's a lazy philosophy. It's an atheist who realizes that atheism won't work, but doesn't want to give God any place in the world. So he has to admit creation and then deny that the Creator is involved in it. That's nonsense. I think it's no less nonsense to think that somehow Satan just started evil. He just pushed the rock off the cliff in the Garden of Eden, and ever since then, all the problems in the world have just been accidental. I just think there has to be more than that if we let the Bible speak on this point. I don't believe Satan is out of business any more than I believe God is out of business. God is not hands-off. Satan is not God, but he's not hands-off either. How can we read a passage like Ephesians 6:12 and make a statement along the lines of that somehow if the devil was eliminated tomorrow, nobody would notice? Our struggle is not against human opponents, but against rulers and authorities and cosmic powers in the darkness around us, against spiritual evil forces in the heavenly realm. I believe it's just flat dangerous to give into the notion that somehow the devil is out of business and we don't have to worry about any personal tempter, and that any evil in the world is just accidental. It is not accidental. It is intentional. It is purposeful. It is organized. It is skillful, and it's launched daily. That's what I believe the Bible teaches. God has alerted us to Satan's work. And it's 4 minutes till, and I'm really getting to the heart of what I want to say. I'm sorry. But I want to think with you in the next lesson about 5 or 6 cases outside of the book of Job that I think show this same pattern, this same picture, that you have God and man and Satan, and that the devil has always been involved in the temptation of man and always will be. The devil and his minions. I can't explain all the logistics of it any more than I can explain how the angels are ministering spirits to the righteous. But I believe that they are. And I believe the devil and his angels are the ministers of evil. Just as they were in the book of Job, under the control and limits that God places, doing all the damage that they can, always showing up, depending on who you are, at the right or the wrong time, in order to try to tempt and test men. And I'd like to take that up next time in our study. And I appreciate your kind attention with this. If you have a question about this study, maybe let me get through the next lesson. And if you still have a question about it, then please, by all means, come to me and talk to me. If you think I've missed the point, help me to make correction. But we do thank you for your kind attention. Please get out your songbooks and turn to the number that's been selected. If you're here this evening and it's your desire to become a child of God, to throw off the shackles of Satan and sin, and to become a servant of Jesus Christ, to be buried in baptism and raised to walk in newness of life, no better time than right now. We're not promised tomorrow. We're not promised another time. And so make up your mind right now. The Lord deserves it. And sin is a dead-end road. If you're here as one who has a child of God, has not been faithful to the Lord, you've not served him as you should, you know that, then make it right with him. And if we can help you in any way, let us know, please, while we stand and while we sing.